Everyone knows the story of the RMS Titanic. Setting sail in April of 1912, this ship was hailed as unsinkable. But on just the fifth night of his maiden voyage from England to New York City, it struck an iceberg and punctured a hole in its side. Sinking in under 3 hours, over 1,000 people who didn't find room in a lifeboat were stuck in the freezing cold water. While the story was largely popularized by the 1997 film, there are hundreds of unique stories of survivors, and today we will look at the account of Charles Joughin, the Titanic ship cook who survived the frigid Atlantic waters for hours by getting absolutely hammered drunk. Born in August of 1978, John was an English boy through and through. Playing soccer all his life and sailing on the ocean first at age 11, he graduated grade school and later became a baker when he worked on various White Star Line steamships in the late 1890s. Marrying his wife Louise in 1906, he went on to have 2 children before accepting his dream job in early February of 1912. Becoming the chief baker on the Titanic, Charles was paid a monthly salary of €12, which when accounting for inflation was equivalent to €1,580 today. With a staff of 13 bakers underneath him, he was in charge of all baked goods the ship ate. Being on board during the first actual sailing of the ship, which was the delivery trip from Belfast, England, where the ship was built, to Southampton, England, where the ship was sailing from, in port over the next week, Charles got accustomed to the kitchen and the various areas of the boat. By the time April 10th rolled around, he was ready to go. The first days of the trip went according to plan, but it was on the night of April 14th that the tragic events took place. At around 11:40 p.m., when the ship was 500 kilometers southeast of Newfoundland, Charles was in his bunk as he was off duty for the night. Sleeping peacefully, he was awoken when he felt the shock of a collision. He immediately got up to see what was happening. Gaining his bearings after he was rudely awakened, word quickly spread from the upper decks that officers were getting the lifeboats ready for launching. Asking around for what exactly had happened, he was told that the ship was taking on water after hitting an iceberg. Charles then leapt into action, sending his 13 workers to the boat deck with provisions for lifeboats, 4 loaves of bread and a handful of biscuits for each boat. Charles stayed behind as he had other things on his mind. Knowing the ship was likely going down, he began to drink his stash of lemon liqueur. Once finishing the half bottle, he reached the top deck a few minutes after midnight. Joining Chief Officer Henry Wilde by Lifeboat 10, Charles helped the stewards get women and children safely into the boats. Some women ran away from the lifeboats, saying they were safer aboard the Titanic. But knowing this was foolish, Charles recounts forcing multiple families into the boat and assuring them that the Titanic was not the safest place to be. Although he was assigned as captain of Boat 10, Charles gave up his spot as it was ready to launch. Already being crewed by 2 sailors and a steward, he knew he was more helpful if he stayed back. Just after Boat 10 was launched, he dipped back below deck and resumed drinking. I found another bottle in the bunks and sat down to nurse it along, aware but not particularly caring that the water now rippled through the cabin door. Finishing what he found, he splashed topside and met with William O'Laughlin, who was the ship's doctor. Discussing their next steps of action, this was the last account of anyone talking to William. Charles then recalled the pair noticing all the lifeboats were launched and there was a feeling of nervousness on board. They then began tossing as many floatable objects they could find into the water, hoping the wooden deck chairs and tables could be used as flotation devices. Afterwards, Charles dipped into the boat's kitchen pantry and began to drink more, but not much time passed before he heard a loud crash coming from inside of the ship, almost as if part of the ship had buckled. Being startled, he left the pantry and joined the crowd of people running towards the rear of the ship. Just as he crossed the well deck, the ship suddenly began to tilt over to the port side. According to Charles, everyone but him was thrown off their feet as he climbed to the starboard side of the deck and held onto the safety rail. Now being on the outside of the ship, he held on for dear life as the ship began to sink. Going almost vertical, Charles rode the ship down as if it were an elevator as he dipped into the water. According to his account, not even his hair got wet as he was the last survivor to enter the water. As with all surviving Titanic crew members, at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, this was the exact moment at which the White Star Line stopped paying. Charles remembers now being in a slight panic. The first stage of cold water immersion is known as cold shock, the horrifying sensation of having the skin cool. Common side effects include gasping and hyperventilation, but Charles was steadfast and treaded water for 2 hours. It's known that 1,503 people died in the water surrounding him that night, and Charles admitted to feeling cold, but nothing he couldn't withstand. He then recalls that when daylight broke, he spotted the upturned collapsible B lifeboat with Second Officer Lightoller and around 30 men standing on the side of the boat. He then began to swim towards it. Realizing there was no room for him on board, fellow cook Isaac Maynard recognized him and held onto his hand as he bobbed in the water. Another lifeboat then arrived, which Charles swam to and he was taken in. Staying there until the RMS Carpathia came to the scene for rescue, the only effects Charles experienced from hours in the cold water was slightly swollen feet. After surviving the disaster, he returned to England and was one of the crew members who reported to testify at the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry. The Wreck Commissioner proclaimed that Charles drinking as much as he did had a lot to do with saving his life. After that, in 1920, Charles moved permanently to Paterson, New Jersey in the United States. He went on to work on ships operated by American export lines, as well as being a baker on board World War II troop transports, before retiring in 1944. In the 100+ years since the tragedy, many have weighed in on this exact story. Most notably was Brock University's Stephen Chung, who's an expert in hypothermic responses, further explaining that while the effects of alcohol is not a good cure for a shipwreck, it certainly increased or bolstered Charles' courage, also decreasing his feeling of cold. He may have been more fearless and therefore less panicked. While scholars have obsessed and will continue to obsess over the reputation of Charles Joughin, beneath it all might have simply been a man unwilling to die.